From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Philip Kennicott. I'm the culture critic of the Washington Post. Since the very beginning of the National Book Festival, the Washington Post has been a sponsor, and we remain so. And I can tell you that one of the great benefits of that is we get to come down here and see that there are in fact still people who are passionate about books. I have the pleasure today of introducing author Bruce Feiler. He has written books that take both the author and the reader on some extraordinary journeys, whether that's under the big top to A Year Spent as Life of a Clown, or in one of his most renowned and popular books, Walking the Bible, where he explored one of the most beautiful and fraught and inspiring and conflicted landscapes in the world. He's also a journalist. He writes the Family Matters column for another newspaper called the New York Times. That appears in the Sunday Styles section. Some of you, if you read the Washington Post, remember that he wrote about a year ago for us on one of the subjects that he has returned to, and that's the way in which Old Testament figures play a recurring role in our life. In that story, he made the case for why he believes that Moses is the patron saint of Washington. His most recent book, however, is very different and very personal. It's a powerful book, and it's called The Council of Dads, My Daughters, My Illness, and the Men Who Could Be Me. And so I'm going to leave Bruce to talk about that book. Please give him a warm welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Philip. It turns out to have been my classmate in college. It's great to be here. I was here who was here? I was here 4 years ago, and it's just amazing to see how this festival has doubled in size, how the rain has finally left. I understand there's been rain basically every year. I'm delighted to be here for the many reasons you might imagine. And in fact, I began my writing life living not that far from here in DuPont Circle almost 20 years ago. Back in the day, there was no internet, no cable, just me and Diane Rehm in my, yes, God bless Diane Rehm. And I have to say, it was one of the great moments in my life when I was on the Diane Rehm show for Walking the Bible, and to know how much she has honored writers and words, and to be on that show, and I've since been on a couple times, has been a highlight of my professional life. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and when I was 4 years old, my parents moved to a new neighborhood, and this was actually in the 60s, and still today, all the streets in this neighborhood were named after Confederate war generals. We lived on Robert E. Lee Boulevard. And for my 5th birthday, my parents gave me an orange Schwinn Stingray bicycle. Okay, it had one of those swooping banana seats and those ape-hanger handlebars because it made the rider look like an orangutan. And I bet I will get a bigger, anybody remember it turns out that the 2/3 of Americans, I didn't know this, had a Schwinn Stingray bicycle. And one day I was exploring our neighborhood, and I decided to take a kind of quick turnaround in this major thoroughfare that bisects our neighborhood when wham, I was hit by a passing sedan. My mangled bike flew in one direction, my mangled body flew in another. And I was lying across the yellow line on the pavement, and one of our neighbors went running over, and she said, Andy, how are you doing?" using the name of my older brother. "I'm Bruce," I said, and promptly passed out. I broke my left femur that day. It's the largest bone in your body, and spent the next 2 months in a wheelchair. Actually, I was in a body cast first. It went from my chin to my knee, and then a steel bar went from my right knee to my left leg. So I was in a wheelchair, and then I went on and lived my life, and basically for most of my life, I never really thought about my illness. In fact, as you all know, and as you heard, I made a living by walking, by traveling around the world, entering different cultures, and writing about them. Walking the Bible became a book that touched people around the world and ultimately became a television series. And I was the walking guy, and as I said, never thought about my accident. Until one day, 2 years ago, I went to get a routine blood test, and an enzyme called the alkaline phosphatase number was a little bit high, and my doctor suggested I go get a scan, which suggested there was some sort of vague tumor in my left leg. That scan led to another, to an MRI, to an X-ray, and then one day I got a call from my doctor: "The tumor in your leg is not consistent with a benign tumor." I stopped walking, and it took a second for my mind to convert that double negative into a much more horrifying negative. I had cancer. and to think that the tumor was in the same leg, in the same bone, in the same place in my body. It seemed like too much of a coincidence. So that afternoon, I went home, and my then 3-year-old identical twin daughters came running to meet me. They had just turned 3, as I said, and they were at this time in their life, they were into all things kind of pink and purple. Tutus and ballerinas and mermaids and makeup. In fact, we called them Pinkalicious and Purplicious. Though I have to say, our favorite nickname came from there when they were born at 6:14 and 6:46 on April 15th, 2005. Our otherwise grim doctor looked at his watch and was like, April 15th, tax day, early filer and late filer. So, okay, on this day, Pinkalicious and Purplicious, they came running in to meet me, and they were doing this dance they had just made up when they turned 3, and they went go faster and faster, and then they tumbled to the ground. And I looked at them, and I crumbled. I kept imagining all the walks I might not take with them, the ballet recitals I might not see, the boyfriends I might not scowl at, the aisles I might walk down. Would they wonder who I was, I thought? Would they yearn for my approval, my love, my voice? 3 days later, I woke with an idea of how I might give them that voice. I would reach out to 6 men from all parts of my life and ask them to be present in the lives of my daughters. And I said to myself that I would call this group of men the Council of Dads. Now, as soon as I had this idea, I decided that I was not going to tell my wife. Okay, she's a very upbeat person. She's got a big smile and big eyes and big hair, although she told me recently I can't say that she has big hair because people will think that she's from Texas. So apparently, it's okay to marry a boy from Georgia, but not to have hair from Texas. In fact, if she were here, which she can't be today because she's in Boston, if she were here, she would tell the story that when we got married, now 7 years ago, we got married in Savannah, my hometown, and we went to get the license, the marriage certificate, whatever, the marriage license, that's what it's called. And there were 3 questions on the questionnaire, the third of which was, are you related? So she was horrified by this, but I was like, if you say yes, you get to skip the 1-month waiting period because you already know each other. You can jump to the front of the line. Anyway, so, okay, so I decided I wasn't going to tell her about the Council of Dads, right? We should happy our way. This is America, right? We're supposed to happy our way through a problem. But the next day, I couldn't control myself. I told her, and she loved the idea, but she instantly started rejecting my nominees. So she said, well, I would love him, but I would never ask him for advice. So it turned out that starting a Council of Dads was a very efficient way to find out what my wife really thought of my friends. So we decided that we needed a set of rules, and so we came up with a group of rules. The first one was no family, only friends. We figured our family would already be there. And then the second was only men, because we were trying to fill the dad space. And then the third was basically a dad for every side. We kind of went through different parts of my personality and tried to pick a dad that represented each one. And then I actually had written a letter to these dads, but rather than mail it, I decided to sit down and read it to them in person. I mean, Linda joked that it was like having 6 different marriage proposals, right? I sort of friend married each of these guys. So the first of these was Jeff Shumlin. Now, Jeff grew up in Vermont, and he runs a student travel company, and he led this tour that kind of taught me how to travel when I graduated from high school. And on that first day, we were in Holland in a youth hostel and built in an old castle. And I snuck out, and then Jeff came and sat beside me, and there was a moat, a fence, and a field of cows. And Jeff leaned over and he said, so have you ever been cow tipping? I was like, cow tipping? He said, yeah, cows sleep standing up, so if you approach them from behind, you can push them over, and they go thud in the mud. So before I had a chance to figure out whether this was true, we had jumped the moat, we had scaled the fence, and we were tiptoeing through the dung and approaching some poor dozing cow. So Jeff went back to Vermont, and this kind of trip taught me how to travel. And he went back to Vermont, took over this travel company that his parents started, and spent part of every day riding around on a tractor and shoveling manure, and part leading students on trips around the world. And this is really what Linda and I wanted him to convey to our girls, what it means to come from a place, but also to be open to the rest of the world. Jeff would teach them how to travel. So a few weeks after my diagnosis, we popped in my car, we drove the kids up to Vermont. Jeff and I went and sat in an apple orchard, and I read him this letter. Will you help be their dad? And I got to the end. He was crying, and I was crying. And then he looked at me and he said, yes. I was like, yes? I had kind of forgotten there was this question at the heart of the letter, and it frankly never occurred to me that anybody would turn me down, although I keep getting asked that question repeatedly. So then I asked Jeff a question. I said, so what is the one piece of advice you would give to my girls? And his answer was so mind-blowing, and I ended up asking this of all the dads in time, and it's really what compelled me to write this book, The Council of Dads, which was to gather all of this life advice into one place. And so in Jeff's case, his advice was, he wanted to teach my girls how to travel. And he said, I want to teach them to be a traveler, not a tourist. So get off the beaten path, get off that bus, seek out what's different, approach the cow. So it's 10 years from now, I said, and my girls are about to take their first trip. What advice would you give them? He said, I would tell your girls to approach this trip as a young child might approach a mud puddle. You can bend over and look at your reflection in the water and maybe make a small ripple. Or you can jump in and thrash around and see what it feels like, what it smells like. As he was talking, he had that glint in his eye that I first saw behind that youth hostel. The glint that says, let's go cow tipping. Even though we didn't tip the cow, even though no one tips the cow, even though cows don't sleep standing up. And Jeff said, I want to see you back here, girls, at the end of this experience, covered in mud. 2 weeks after my diagnosis, a biopsy confirmed I had a 7-inch osteosarcoma in my left femur. 600 Americans get an osteosarcoma every year. 85% are under 21. Only 100 adults a year get this disease. 20 years ago, doctors would have cut off my leg and hoped, and there was a 15% survival rate. But they determined that one cocktail of chemo could be effective, and I went and got that cocktail. And I got what doctors call a chemo sandwich, which I don't recommend you get in the tent up the pavilion here, which was 4 months of chemo, followed by a 15-hour surgery in which my surgeon, Dr. John Healy, removed my left femur and replaced it with titanium, took my fibula from my calf and relocated it to my thigh, and then took out a third of my quadricep muscle. A surgery so rare, only 2 people have survived it before me. And my reward for surviving it was to go back for 4 more months of chemo. It was, as we called it around our house, the lost year. And we were worried from the beginning about how our girls might react. And I have to say, in the beginning, there were some nightmares. One of them would get up in the middle of the night, and there were some awkward moments. One night I had a nightmare that I was walking through my house, and I sat at my desk and saw photos of someone else's children sitting on my desk. But by the end, I came to see that maybe, perhaps, it made our daughters an ounce more compassionate and a dose more caring. They would run to embrace the girl with an amputated leg at the playground. They would notice the girl with the rabbit with crutches in the back of a children's book illustration. And my daughter, Tybee, had a great line one day. She said, Daddy, I think she began to realize how valuable her parents were. She said, Daddy, I have so much love in my body for you. I can't stop giving you hugs and kisses. And when I have no more love left, I just drink milk, because that's where love comes from. And one night, my daughter Eden came to my side of the bed, and as I got up and went to put her back to sleep, she reached for my crutches. And if I could cling to one memory from my lost year, it would be me and my daughter walking down a darkened hallway at 4 a.m, with 5 little fingers grasping the spongy handle underneath my hand. I didn't need the crutch anymore at that time. I was walking on air. One interesting thing about the Council of Dads was that it forced me to sit down with my closest friends and tell them what they meant to me. And I began to realize how rare that is in this culture. If you think about it, we all have our work and we have our family, but somehow friends get pushed aside. There's almost something that conspires against friendship in our life today. And one thing the Council of Dads, and as I've seen now people making these around the country, around the world, the councils of moms that are emerging out of this, is that this has proven to be a bridge that invites our friends into the heart of our lives. And the other thing I learned is how much the role of men has changed over time. I mean, if I think about my father and my grandfather, both of whom I write about in my book, there was something about them that they were not so communicative. The men in my council, we talk about our friends, our feelings, our fears, even our weight. I mean, Linda kept saying in these conversations with these dads, she's like, it's exactly what the moms talk about at school drop-off every day. And to me, no one embodies this modern malehood more than David Black. Now, I first met David, he's my literary agent. I first met him in his office in Manhattan. And I should say, he's 5'3.5" on a good day, standing erect in cowboy boots. And he took one look at my 6'2" body and said, if I were your height, I'd be in the NBA. Self-delusion is a wonderful thing. It's even better in an agent. So David, he embodies kind of a modern manhood. You know, on the man front, can I say this for the posterity of the Library of Congress? He answers the phone, yo, motherfucker. He gives obscure speeches on bottles of wine nobody cares about, and on his 50th birthday, he bought himself a convertible sports car. But actually, like a lot of men, he's impatient. He bought it on his 49th. But on the modern man front, he hugs, he bakes, he leaves work early to coach Little League. Someone asked me if David cried when I invited him to be in the Council of Dads. I was like, David cries when you invite him for a walk. So David is a literary agent, which means he's a broker of dreams in a world where most dreams don't come true. But he's very good at handling both the aspirations and the setbacks, and this is what we wanted him to teach our girls, how to dream. So I said to him, so what's the most valuable thing you can teach a dreamer? He said, a belief in themselves. I said, okay, that's fine, but when I met you, I might have had belief in myself, but I was at a wall. I had no path after writing 3 books to some degree of success. He said, well, I don't see the wall, and I'm telling you the same. Of course, you may encounter a wall from time to time, but I'm going to show you how to get over it, around it, under it, or through it. But whatever you do, don't succumb to it. Don't give in to the wall. So it's 15 years from now. I said, one of my daughters plops down, and she says, I have a dream. I want to write a book, or open a restaurant, or run a marathon. What do you tell her? He said, I'll tell her, let's make the awesome mundane. Let's make an outline for the book, or a business plan for the restaurant, a route to the top of the mountain. And if that dream should fail, I said, then I will tell her, let's find a dream that can work. It may not be the first dream or the second dream, it's a dream nonetheless. Because anybody can dream an impossible dream, but only a few find a dream that's possible. And those are the ones that are happy. My house is not far from the Brooklyn Bridge, and during the year and a half that I was on crutches, it became a sort of symbol to me. And one day I said to my girls, come on, let's take a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. So we set out. Linda was beside me, I was on crutches. My girls were doing these kind of rock star poses they had learned when that made them look like Mick Jagger. And walking, because walking is one of the first things I lost during that year, I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And if you do think about it, walking is really the one thing that most distinguishes us from our ancestors. And yet for the 4 million years that humans have walked upright, the act is essentially unchanged. It's really, the act is very simple but very hard, because every step, as my physical therapist likes to say, is a tragedy waiting to happen. You almost tumble with one leg and then you catch yourself with the other. But the chief act of going slow is that you begin to develop a community along the way. So you hurry, you get where you're going, but you get there alone. You go slow, you get there, but you get there with this community that you've developed along the way. At the risk of admission, I was never nicer than when I was on crutches. 200 years ago in Paris, a new type of pedestrian appeared. He was called a flaneur, one who ambles the arcades. And for these men of leisure, they showed off that they were men of status by taking turtles for walks and letting the reptile set the pace. And I love this ode to slow moving. It's become a piece of advice for my girls. Take a walk with a turtle. Behold the world in pause. And that sense of slowing down, of pausing, may be the single biggest lesson I learned. The Liberty Bell has a quote from Moses on its side. Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And that comes from a passage in Leviticus in which we are told that every 7 years the land is supposed to lay fallow. And every 7 sets of 7 years, the land gets an extra year of rest. And that 50th year is called the Jubilee year. It's actually the origin of the term Jubilee. And during that year, we're supposed to be reunited with the ones we love. And though I'm still short of 50, that perfectly captures my experience. My lost year was my Jubilee year. By laying fallow, I was surrounded with the ones I love, and I planted the seeds for a healthier future. On the 1-year diagnosis of my cancer, I went to see my doctor, Dr. John Healy. And by the way, Healy, great name for a doctor. He is the president of the International Society of Limb Salvage, which is like the least euphemistic name I've ever heard. And he also pauses. He speaks like 3 words a minute. Those of you who may have seen the special that Sanjay Gupta did on my family, I mean, he spoke faster than that than I've ever heard him speak. So I said to him, I said, "Doctor, if my girls come to you one day and say, 'What should we learn from our daddy's story?' what would you tell him?" And he paused about as long as I ever heard anyone pause. And he said, "I would tell my daughters what I have learned, and that is everybody dies, but not everybody lives. I want you to live." I wrote a letter to my daughters that appears at the end of the Council of Dads, and I listed all the wisdom I heard from my dads. You've heard a couple here today. There are many more. Approach the cow, live the questions, pack your flip-flops, don't see the wall, live the questions. Did I say that one? Harvest miracles. And when I looked at this, I realized, you know what? This is sort of a psalm book of living for my girls. And that's when I realized it was intended for them, but maybe we're the ones who need it. And that's the secret at the heart of the Council of Dads. Linda and I did it for our girls, but it changed us. And so I stand here today, as you've seen, recovered from my journey and walking without crutches or a cane for the first time in 2 years. And I leave you with this message. Thank you. May you find a wall to get over, around, or through. May you find a mud puddle to jump in one day. And one of these days, grab a friend, grab a turtle, and take a long, slow walk. Thank you very much. Look at this. Labeled water at the National Mall. Okay. So I will be happy to answer. We have 2 microphones. I'm sure you know the drill. I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you might have about this, or walking the Bible, or anything else. Okay, someone's going to come up to me. There we go. Here we go. Excellent. Somebody run. I can't run, so you run for me. Yes.
I just wondered if you ever thought about doing something like the last lecture.
I do a lot of lecturing. I don't know what you mean by something like the last lecture. You mean like a there's actually, if you go to
It's a book that.
I know the book, yeah. David Black actually represented it. No, in fact, David Black, my agent, oddly represented both Tuesdays with Morrow and the last lecture, and now the Council of Dads. I mean, I do a lot of talking. In fact, if you go to councilofdads.com, you can see it. You can get a download a starter kit for people who are starting these. And so I do a fair bit of talking about this at medical groups and synagogues and universities and places like that. Yeah. Let's see, over here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, what is your next project?
The question is, what is my next project? I have a number of things that are in the works. As you heard Philip mention earlier, I now write a column called Family Matters in the Sunday New York Times, the Sunday Style section. So as you're on your way to the wedding announcements, that's what you're after. We all know, the sports section for women. I hope to stop you for a few minutes on page 2. I am doing, I'm actually beginning to write a book about family life in America today. I'm actually working on another television series in the wake of Walking the Bible with PBS about pilgrimage. And I will also say I'm not exactly involved in this, but I'm somewhat involved, and that is the Council of Dads is now, has been bought by Fox Broadcasting and is in development with a guy named Peter Tolan, who did Larry Sanders and Rescue Me and Murphy Brown, to turn, I'm not making this up, to turn into a sitcom. And I have to say, in his version, I actually never said this, I don't know how this will go over, but in his version, he's actually doing it in the original conception. So there's actually a dead dad, as I call it. There's a widow and this Council of Dads, because everybody wants to know what happened to the council, and so my book doesn't go there, fortunately. So he's going there. So as I said, it's the sitcom about my death. Anyway, so that's. But they've asked me to, they pay me one of these consulting deals. So I don't know what exactly I'm supposed to offer, but that's another thing that's going on. Yes, sir.
In walking the Bible, you met
Yeah.
some incredible scholars
Yeah.
and wise people, and I wonder if you're keeping in touch with any of them, and if you have any advice for the diplomats in this city right now.
The question is about walking the Bible, and yes, I met a lot of great people. Avner Gorin, who's the archaeologist, who I traveled with both in the book and the television show, still very close. Actually, was at our home earlier this summer. For those of you who read the book, Father Justin, who's the Texas monk who lives at St. Catherine's, has now become the chief librarian. And I actually list his email address in the book because there's a burning bush there in St. Catherine's, and there's a very memorable scene in the book when I first arrived at St. Catherine's, which is in the Sinai, which is where the monks say the original Mount Sinai was, and there's a bush. It's actually a rare raspberry bramble that the monks say is the actual burning bush where Moses saw the face of God. And right next to this bush, which is a big kind of weeping willow kind of thing, is a fire extinguisher. And the first time I saw it, I thought, is this an eyesore? And then I realized the unintended here. Is this in case the burning bush catches on fire? And if it does catch on fire, do I look for the face of God, or do I put the fire out? And years later, when we went to make the TV show, we filmed a little sequence with me and the fire extinguisher, and we sent it back to LA to be edited, and the editors took out the fire extinguisher. And when the draft came in, I was like, why'd you take out the fire extinguisher? They said, you made that up. That's just a really bad joke, and you made that up. And I was like, no, I didn't make it up at all. So I'm still in touch with Father Justin and a lot of those people. And that journey does continue in the book Where God Was Born, which is what I talked about last time I was here. And I was just actually for those of you who are coming to the signing, they actually have tons of copies of Abraham, Walking the Bible, Where God Was Born, America's Prophets. They have all that stuff here. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious if the travel program from Vermont was the Experiment in International Living. And if so, give a brief commercial for it or describe the actual program.
The Experiment for International Living is run out of Brattleboro, Vermont. Actually, I will be in Brattleboro a week from today at the Brattleboro Literary Festival. This is run out of Putney, Vermont. It's called Putney Student Travel. So it's a smaller family-run operation that's been in the same family for 50 years, and it's fantastic. GoPutney.com. I'll give it an ad too, but it's the same spirit as the Experiment. Yes, sir. They're giving me a minute here.
Sure. Any suggestions for somebody with some similar ideas to start writing their own book?
Well, I'm a big believer in, for aspiring writers, that the most important thing is to write. I find in talking to people that there are a lot of aspiring writers who are a lot better at aspiring than they are at writing. When I was in college, I went to see William Baldwin speak at Yale, and he said, you want to be a writer, kid? Get a chair, get a table, get a piece of paper, and get a pen, and start writing. I actually think that, when I went to Japan 20 years ago and started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper, I think that the barriers to entry were actually a lot higher then. So I think we see now with blogging, there's any newspapers, Washington Post not least among them, having written 3 pieces free for them in the last month, that a lot of people will take free content. And so I think the most important thing is to get published. And it can be a church newsletter, it can be a blog, it can be a letter that gets circulated to friends, because I think that the most important thing is to get into the act of communication. And so that you start showing your writing. I think journaling is fine, and it has had a lot of value to me and lots of people over the years, but ultimately I think writing is about communication. And I was in the media tent earlier saying, what does it mean to you to come to the National Book Festival? And I said, it means to me to be reminded ultimately that this is about communication, to have writers in touch with readers, having feedback. That's what it's about. So I'm delighted to be here to share this story with all of you. If you want to email me, you can go to brucefeiler.com. I answer every email that comes, and happy reading. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.